Welcome to Beat Diabetes. I'm Dennis Pollock, and today we're going to talk about Alzheimer's, dementia, and related diseases of the brain that relate to diabetes. Alzheimer has been called type 3 diabetes, and if you do a search either on Google or on YouTube or almost anywhere else that talks about diseases, and you type in diabetes and Alzheimer's or diabetes and dementia, you just find beaucoup articles, videos, all kinds of information that link these two together. Can it be proven at this point? Probably not, but there is the strongest suggestion, hint, correlation that seems to say that when you are diabetic and when you've got that surging glucose and that surging insulin, it's going to affect your brain, your mind, and you could well, doesn't mean you have to, but you could well end up as someone having dementia or Alzheimer's. So wanted to share a few things. One of the first things I wanted to talk about, and this was something I heard years ago, and it has stayed with me. They were talking about a high school football player who had been through a few serious concussions, and it had affected his brain. So this young man, I think, was 18, and the doctor did an examination of him and reported that he had the brain of a 65-year-old man. Now, when I heard that, I wasn't far from 65. I think it was a little over 65, maybe 67, something like that. But it was kind of a shock to hear this doctor saying, well, he's got the brain of a 65-year-old man, as though 65-year-old men, they don't have much of a brain. And I thought, wow. But of course, the reality is everything tends to run down when you get older. And that includes the mind and the brain. And there's a reason why 22-year-olds don't get Alzheimer's very much. 25-year-olds, 32-year-olds don't get dementia hardly ever. But 70-year-olds do, 80-year-olds do for sure. So let's talk about it a little bit and show the link that appears to be between diabetes, high glucose, high insulin, and dementia. We've seen it in the news. We've recently, well, I probably don't even need to say recently, but it turns out we had a president of our nation that had some pretty serious cognitive issues, whether you call it dementia or Alzheimer's. I'm no doctor, I can't say, but he had some pretty serious cognitive issues. And I can remember seeing that and hearing about it for some years now. And one of the things about President Biden was that every time you saw him out and about, he always had an ice cream in his hand. And he just seemed to love his ice cream. And I remember thinking, the last thing in the world someone needs to eat if they've got cognitive problems is ice cream. And of course, there's others. Gene Hackman died recently, the actor, and he apparently had severe Alzheimer's to the point where though his wife apparently died before he did in this house, he lived for some days. Bruce Willis, another actor who has some form of dementia. I think they call it aphasia, but they also talk about dementia of the frontal lobe. So it happens to people, famous people and ordinary people. And a lot of times, back when I was a kid, they just talk about, well, old people, they get senile. And they never thought of it as a real disease or as something that could be prevented. You're just old, you get senile. But there's more to it than that. One of the things that I find, and I have to admit in my own, in Dennis Pollock, I noticed that I don't have the mentality I had when I was younger. I don't come up with words as fast. There are things I don't remember. And I think to myself, I should know that. I should know the name of that person. I remember watching a video recently about famous actors that passed away. And they showed their picture first, and then you heard the name. And when I saw the picture, I recognized the picture, but I couldn't always come up with the name. Then after a while of thinking about it, I could. And one of the things that tells you a person is struggling a little bit cognitively is when they use all the time. Is kind of like a filler that means I can't think of what I should be saying next. But if I say it doesn't sound quite as bad as if I just get silent and don't say anything. So we throw in uhs. But sadly, I've seen 30-year-olds use all the time. Sometimes I think it's just a bad habit. But in some cases, it means give me some time and I'll figure out what I need to say next, or I'll figure out the name of what I'm trying to think of. Another aspect of this dementia, I remember hearing about a lady who couldn't find her car keys, and then she found them in the refrigerator. And she was like, well, what in the world? Why would my car keys be in the refrigerator? But oftentimes you're so focused, and I hate to admit it, I haven't maybe done that, but there's times where you get so focused on a particular thought that you're thinking that all the other thoughts that you would think you could carry simultaneously, they get shoved out of the way. The classic example of this is you go into a room and you're focused on a certain thing that you're wanting or thinking about, and you forgot why you went into the room. And then you turn around and you leave, and then sometime later you realize, oh yeah, I went into the room to do this or that, and I've done that. So I think we all sense we're susceptible. Now, if you're 30 years old, you're not worried about it because it's a long way off. But when you're my age, you think about those things, and when some of those telltale signs indicate that you're not quite firing on all cylinders the way you used to, you get a little concerned. And of course, the question is, what can I do about it? What can I do to either A, slow it down to where I can stay relatively mentally fit and sharp as long as possible, or B, just prevent it altogether, so that by the time I pass away, nobody's going to be able to say, well, boy, he sure had lost it mentally. My dad was like that. My dad was sharp. I never even thought of him even losing a step. Now, he may have, and had I asked him, do you notice anything different about your thinking process, he might have been able to tell me. I never asked him that. But as far as I could tell, he just seemed about it the same at 85 as he was at 55. My mom was a different story. She was slurring her speech toward her latter years. She lived to be 80, but had severe diabetes. And there were things she said that you realized she wasn't quite thinking so clearly. One that comes to mind is when she came to visit our house. I think it was for my oldest daughter's graduation. And my younger son was playing with a balloon, just kind of tossing it up and hitting it around the room. Just an ordinary balloon. And my mother said, be careful, you don't want to break a window. And my son looked at her and said, Grandma, this is just a balloon. And then she kind of laughed with embarrassment and said, oh yeah, that's right. So, I mean, she didn't quite have it all going on yet. And you can't blame anybody for losing it. I mean, it's part of the aging, but it doesn't have to be a serious part of most of our lives. And in fact, many people can live their life out, pass away, and nobody would hardly know. They might know they weren't thinking so clearly, but others wouldn't. Well, let me read you a few things that a couple of men have said. Dr. Mark Hyman did a video about diabetes and Alzheimer's, and he mentions that you can have pre-dementia just like you have pre-diabetes. And he said often when you have pre-diabetes, that's when you get pre-dementia, and you've got some of those signs that you're not quite all there, but you haven't lost it altogether. And one of the things that you hear frequently when you do a little research, as I've done recently, is that it's inflammation of the brain or insulin resistance of the brain. I wanted to read a few things by Dr. Ben Bickman and things that he has said. And he calls it insulin resistance of the brain. And we think about inflammation. Inflammation is a huge deal to people that understand metabolic syndrome and insulin resistance and diabetes. And the one thing you want to avoid is inflammation. And you can have inflammation of the brain, and it can mess you up every which way. So Dr. Hyman, in his little talk, he says, well, control your insulin and balance your blood sugar. In other words, keep your blood sugar running along and humming along at a fairly normal level, and that's going to keep your insulin relatively low. Now, speaking of Dr. Bickman, one of the things he said was my biggest surprise of all when I read some of his books or one of his books, and then I looked at some of the things he was saying in a video. And let me just read it to you. He says, fasting insulin levels carry a stronger significant or statistical significance than your age. Let me say that again. Fasting insulin levels are more likely to predict that you either have Alzheimer's or dementia or you're on your way to getting it. Fasting insulin is a bigger predictor or a bigger correlation than how old you are. I mean, again, we just thought, well, the older you get, the more likely you are, and there's truth to that. But another factor that's even bigger, according to Dr. Benjamin Bickman, who's a researcher, is that your fasting insulin is going to tell the story and is going to indicate whether you're likely headed toward Alzheimer's or dementia, even more so than how old you are. And there's good news in that, because you can control fasting insulin. I can't control how old I am. There's not a single thing I can do about it. I can wish and make positive confessions and try to wish upon a star, do whatever. I can't control my age, but I can sure control my fasting insulin. When I have eggs and bacon as a meal, I'm not going to have the glucose surge afterwards, and I'm not going to have the insulin surge. And if I do meals like that with low carbs and green leafy vegetables and salads and meat and high-fat dairy, my glucose levels are going to go almost nowhere, and as a result, my fasting insulin levels are going to get better and better and better. And if the fasting insulin levels tell the story about Alzheimer's and your likelihood to get it, or the fact that you may be in the early stages of it, if I can control that, that's something I can do. Now, it's not like that's going to be the whole story necessarily, but apparently that's a pretty big deal. Bickman says this: as the brain becomes progressively insulin resistant, it becomes less and less able to obtain enough glucose to meet its energy demands. To me, that's kind of shocking. It's basically saying, even though you may eat a high carb diet, you may eat a lot of sugar, you're not going to get enough glucose because you're so insulin resistant. Your brain can't function and can't really process the glucose. You're jamming your body with sugar and carbs and starches, but because you're so insulin resistant in the brain, your brain can't even get enough glucose to function well. That, to me, is an amazing thought. So let me give you 4 simple thoughts as we wrap this up. Number 1, insulin resistance, which is essentially hyperinsulinemia due to a diet overdose of carbs, sugars, and starches. So insulin resistance is basically hyperinsulinemia, which means you got way too much insulin going on in your body and in your brain, and it's due to eating too many carbs and starches and sugars. So number 1, when you deal with the insulin resistance by dealing with the carbs, sugars, and starches, and you bring everything under control, you've done yourself a great favor. Just limit your carbs and exercise and use your brain to stay mentally and physically active. Use your brain. And that's one thing I don't have to worry about these days, because keeping up with Spirit of Grace Ministries and keeping up with Beat Diabetes, and I just built a website for my wife, and I've been involved in rebuilding a website for Spirit of Grace Ministries. Been using my brain a lot, and of course I write articles as well. So that's one thing I don't have to worry about, but I've still got to keep my diet low. Just because I'm mentally active doesn't necessarily mean that all is well if I'm jamming carbs, sugars, and starches into my body. 3, age is going to catch up with us all, but the longer we can prolong our health and our mind, the happier and more productive our life will be. In other words, yeah, I'm going to fall apart at some point. Now, the best and most blessed person is one who falls apart all at once over a course of a month or two, and they're gone. And up till that last month or two, they were doing fine, which was my dad's case, except his, I think, was about 6 or 8 months. But still, he lived to be 87, and 86 and plus of those years, he was doing great. That would be my choice, but we don't always get our choice. But nevertheless, we want to stretch it out. We want to stretch out our health. No, I can't prevent the fact that I'll fall apart at some point. But if I can stretch it out a bit, all the better. And so that's what we want. And, if I'm going to get dementia, and I live to be 90, it would be better to get it in my 90th year than when I turn 75. So, again, it turns out, number 4, a diagnosis of diabetes may be the best thing that could happen to you, because if you get so scared and so motivated that you cut your carbs and you're just worried about blood sugar, you're just worried about diabetes, you're just worried about keeping your legs and your feet and getting rid of your neuropathy and making sure you can still see, you're worried about all the diabetes things, but you may be doing a tremendous favor to your brain and your life as well. If you've recently been diagnosed with diabetes and you've just discovered this channel, let me recommend that you go to our Uploads page, which will give you access to every diabetic video we've posted since we began. As you work your way through all our videos, I believe you'll find the help you need. A link to our Uploads page is in the description.